Good morning, our viewers. Today is Sunday, September 17th, and it is 6:04 a.m. in United States East Coast. We are having the 7th episode of Strategically Speaking with Dr. Adityanjee, and we have a very, very famous guest with whom I'll be carrying on a conversation. Our guest today is Professor Madhav Das Nalapat. Professor Nalapat is the first UNESCO chair holder and professor of geopolitics at University of Manipal. He has been editor of several newspapers, including Mathrubhumi, Times of India, and currently editor-in-chief of the Sunday Guardian. He continues to be professor of international relations and geopolitics at University of Manipal and has been supervising students, PhD scholars, etc. He is widely traveled and widely interviewed. He has advised several governments on strategic issues in Asia Pacific region. And the reason we have him today as a guest for this conversation is because of a new book he just wrote. And the title of this new book is Cold War 2.0, Illusion versus Reality. So I will be holding a conversation with Professor Nalapat, and he has this book right now. It's being published by the Penguin in India, and it is almost 200 pages long book. He just actually put it for our viewers. If I may have the, a chance, I'm going to share the cover page of the book. I presume people can see the cover page, the both front and back of this book, Cold War 2.0, Illusion versus Reality. And myself and Professor Nalapat will have a conversation about this book. So welcome to our Council for Strategic Platform. Professor Nalapat, you are always welcome. You have been on our platform before. Kindly unmute yourself before we start the formal interview. You are muted.
Yes, I'm unmuted now. Please go ahead.
So my first question for you is, what inspired you to write this book? And the reason I'm asking this is because in the epilogue, in the foreword that is written by Shiv Shankar Menon, the former National Security Advisor, he states that Professor Nalapat's views are becoming mainstream of broad segments of Indian opinion. And if I draw an analogy, in United States, in the Cold War 1.0, there was this broad classification of strategic experts into hawks versus doves. And it appears from your writings that you belong, at least in the Indian category of hawks, where Dr. Shiv Shankar Menon belonged to the category of doves. So for somebody like Shiv Shankar Menon to acknowledge, although grudgingly, that Professor Nalapat's views are becoming now, part of the mainstream of broad Indian opinion, what was the reason that inspired you to write this book? Please go ahead.
Well, Dr. Adityanjee, the fact is that I've had a strong belief in my country. I've had a very strong belief in that. I've had also a very strong belief that the United States and India working together can play a very consequential role in world affairs. And about 30 years ago, I decided to concentrate a little, actually, a little over 30 years ago. I decided to concentrate on two countries, United States and China. So, both in terms of visits, in terms of research, etc., these were two countries I focused on. And at that point in time, China, frankly, was not very much, in focus as it subsequently became. But the perception, in a way, was that these two countries are going to have a very interesting dynamic uh, with each other. And India is going to be in the middle of that dynamic. So the question comes as to what role India should play in this emerging dynamics between one side of the Pacific Ocean and the other. Now, from that point of view, actually, Dr. Adityanjee, if I may say so, there was a previous book which came out last August. This particular book that you very kindly showed has come out this September, that is this month. The last August, the book was actually 75 Years of Indian Foreign Policy. It was brought out by Rupa Publications, publishers, a very good publishing house which is based in India. And it basically gave an argument about the need for India and the United States to work in a much closer relationship than they had in the past. So when I traced the 75 years of our foreign policy, I didn't, I, it was not basically this happened, that happened, whatever, but in a sense of connecting the dots and basically picking out the dots that we missed out on. For example, the UNSC, or for example, ASEAN, or so many other things. So it was a critique, in a sense, of Indian foreign policy, an assessment of the world as it has been developing, and an assessment of the need for the United States and India to come together. There was a certain amount of blowback when that book came out. I remember that there was a discussion at the India International Center in Delhi. I mean, I have no reason, but the fact is that I mean, a lot of very interesting discussions took place there and take place in that center. There was a certain amount of blowback. I mean, Professor Muni and others, very distinguished scholars, they felt I was being a little too partial to the American side. The fact is, I was being partial to one side, which is my side, the Indian side. And when I talk about any other country, it's with reference to the Indian side. And that book came out. This book essentially is in which I explain why the relationship between India and the United States needs to be close. And you will recall, Dr. Adityanjee, that I have been several times very critical of US foreign policy. In the matter of, for example, Ukraine, I have been extremely critical of the Light Brigade charge of President Biden and others in the matter of Ukraine. In the case of the Russians, I was opposed. I think I was possibly almost alone in being opposed to the S-400 deal with Russia. At that point in time, actually, people in the government came back to me and said, "Look, you're openly, talking about this deal, but what's the option that we have?" So I said, "Why not THAAD?" And it was pointed out to me, and I mean, by very eminent people whom I'm not going to name, because in my journalism and in several of my writings, I keep my sources very private. That first of all, the Americans have not really offered THAAD to India. That came as a surprise to me. And secondly, there were some informal feelers during the Trump administration. And Donald Trump, frankly, I mean, what really counts for him is the almighty dollar. So I was told that informally, they were quoting an extremely high price for the THAD, assuming that they agreed to sell it to India. Now, we all know Donald Trump wanted a lot of money from Japan, he wanted a lot of money from Korea, he wanted a lot of money from India. The fact is that if THAD had been installed, let's say, in the Nicobar or the Andaman Islands, it would have been very, very useful for US security, our security certainly, US security, the security of the Indo Pacific, a free and open, inclusive Indo Pacific. If I were, in the United States, advising anybody in the United States, I would advise them to give it free of cost to India because it is a very important, installation where the security of the U.S. is concerned. And we all know the United States has spent a ton of money in a lot of places, and a lot of that money has just gone up in smoke, as we saw, for example, in Afghanistan, where the United States just walked away and leaving behind a huge amount of weapons and, frankly, just burning up a huge amount of taxpayer dollars. But it was not an offer. And so I was told, what offer, but what chance do we have? Then, of course, friends in Washington, whom I respect greatly, those who are connected to the Pentagon, they said, look, you're definitely going to be sanctioned. Our chaps came back to me and said, look, we are very certain that we have Prime Minister Narendra Modi here. He would not be taking a decision like this if there was a chance that we would be sanctioned. And we are very certain that there will not be sanctions on India for purchase of S-400. I was a little skeptical until I heard that, okay, the Prime Minister himself signed off on that, and he signed off on the fact that there would not be sanctions. And as it happened, I was wrong, and the people who had briefed me were right. There were no sanctions on India after the purchase of S-400. But it turned out I was right after all in another matter, and that is that we have not been getting deliveries of S-400, in the way we should have been getting deliveries. Ukraine conflict is one thing, the link with China is another. But the fact is that, relying on critical defense equipment from a country that is now interlinked in defense with a country which is your biggest, let's be honest, your biggest strategic enemy. I mean, Nikki Haley called China an enemy of the United States. Let me say strategic enemy. I don't think I'm being a hawk or a dove or anything of the kind. I'm simply being realistic. And sometimes the hawks are realistic, sometimes the doves are realistic. Where it's necessary to be realistic as a dove, I am a dove. For example, the Indian relationship with Russia. I've been strongly in favor from the very start of the Ukraine war of buying as much Russian oil as we can afford, as much of Russian resources as we can afford. You can say that's a very dovish stance in Russia. I took a very hawkish stand on S-400. I've taken a very dovish stand on some aspects of the United States policy. I've taken a very hawkish stand on some other aspects of US policy. From my point of view, a stand which I believe is congruent with the interests of India. This book actually, the two books actually are two bookends. One, the essentiality of a very good relationship between our two democracies, and two, the reason why. And the reason why is given in Cold War 2.0, which is now going on. I remember when I first started talking about Cold War 2.0 many years ago. I mean, and even today, people say, no, no, no. Even the United States, no, no, no. There's no question of a Cold War. Because they believe that Cold War 2.0 is, in a sense, like Cold War 1.0. It's very different. Russia is different, China is different, the dynamics are different, the geopolitics are different. But the point about which I'm trying to say is more important even than the first Cold War went by without a direct clash between the United States and the USSR. The second point is we are, in a sense, where you go back in the 20th century, go back 100 years, we are, in a sense, 100 years ago, and let's say 2023, 1923, and we are leading to the 1930s. And if we're not careful, if we don't make very certain that we understand the dynamics, the evolving dynamics of what is happening in the world, at that point in time in in Europe, at this point in time in Asia, where you have, if I may say so, a predatory kind of thinking, when you have, for example, a thinking that basically is expansionist, and you don't check it in time, you don't deter it in time, a world war becomes inevitable. I wrote this book, Dr. Adityanjee, not in to celebrate or to spark off or in any way to encourage a new world war. I wrote this to prevent a world war, and prevention is through deterrence. The kind of deterrence that throughout the 1930s eluded the both sides of the Atlantic against an expansionist power, against an expansionist and very aggressive leadership. We should not make that same mistake this time around. We should deter. And we are in a phase now, frankly, in which, is it 1938? Is it 1937? Is it 1939? Well, it's certainly not 1939 yet. But looking at the way the South China Sea has now become a PLA lake, looking at the way that you have got very aggressive activities now. The ASEAN countries, three cheers for them. They, along with India, stood out against this kind of the kind of wrong maps that the Chinese have done, and they have nibbled at territory. They have nibbled at the airspace of Taiwan. They have nibbled at the sovereignty of Taiwan. They have nibbled at the territory of India. And a few days ago, I had a discussion. In fact, I think it was yesterday itself with Scott Faulkner, the conservative thinker, and myself in our department of geopolitics. And Scott was, I mean, talking in terms of sovereignty and the right of territorial integrity. So I just simply pointed out that Indian sovereignty, way back in 1947, the Pakistanis grabbed our land. Way back in the 1950s, the Chinese grabbed Aksai Chin. We don't see that the Americans were talking very much about Aksai Chin. We don't see the Americans talking very much or the Europeans talking very much about POK. And I know very well, I've been to the United States many times. Racism is there, but it's fortunately a fringe. I don't believe policy is based on racist principles. But I'd like to say, you're talking about the sovereignty of Ukraine. What about the sovereignty of the world's biggest democracy, which has been challenged by China, challenged by Pakistan? And you are punishing Russia for, of course, the reality is that, Ukraine at one time was part of the Soviet Union. You're saying that Ukraine is central to Western security, that if you don't have Ukraine within the Western fold, de facto or de jure, there'll be a meltdown of Western security. Then was there a meltdown of Western security in France, in Germany, in Britain, in the US when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union? I mean, give me a break. The only value of Ukraine is as a land bridge to Russia in the event of a kinetic conflict involving surface troops entering into Russia, or vice versa. That's the only value of Ukraine, apart from food and fertilizer. There's much more value in Taiwan in terms of technology, in terms of chips. And you have seen a systematic chipping away of the sovereignty of Taiwan. Of course, you've been for so many years, ever since Nixon, we're not even recognizing Taiwan as the independent country it is. That's a different matter. You don't have a US embassy in Taiwan, for example. And the kind of weapons that you're supplying to Taiwan are not even 1/50th in quantity and 1/3 in quality of the weapons that are being supplied to Ukraine. So is Taiwan less important than Ukraine? Is Asia less important than Europe? Is Russia so much more powerful and a bigger threat than China? I mean, I don't think so. And I'm very surprised that you have this charge of the Light Brigade. And it's not only the Democrats, you have Lindsey Graham and you have Mitch McConnell and you have so many others. Charge, 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 charge. as though we are back in the era of the first Cold War. I'm sorry, you're in the era of Cold War 2.0. That's very different from the first Cold War. And I wanted to bring the world, bring to attention that we are in a new Cold War. We are back in the 1930s. At what exact years, is 37 or 38? I don't know, one of these 2 years. 38, the Czechoslovak crisis happened. I don't know if it's 38 or possibly I think it's 37. But we are heading for a world war unless we have a deterrent system in place. Part of that deterrent system I explained in my in that earlier bookend of 75 years of Indian foreign policy. I've explained why we need that deterrent system in Cold War 2.0. So that's what I'm saying, Dr. Adityanjee. And as I said, as recently as just a day ago, I had this open discussion which is going to come online, by the way. In a few days, the link will come online. You can watch it with Scott and myself. And I pointed this out to Scott. And my question to you, as a proud citizen of the United States, which is what you are, and something that I deeply respect, a country I deeply respect, and I must say I deeply respect our NRI community. They are absolutely wonderful people. They've done so much to bring India and the US together. I would like to say, compare the arms that are going to Taiwan or the arms that are going to India from the United States. Compare the financial terms of the arms being supplied to Taiwan and India, top dollar, and the arms being supplied to Ukraine, free of cost. Compare the quantum. Compare the oxygen that's being spent on Ukraine as compared to India. And I mean, I'm putting Taiwan also, ASEAN, all these countries, Tibet, Xinjiang, Manchuria, Inner Mongolia, all these territories have been taken over. And you have here, American diplomats coming and saying sovereignty and integrity. European diplomats coming and saying territorial integrity and sovereignty. Well, what about the territorial integrity and sovereignty of ASEAN? What about the integrity and territorial sovereignty of Taiwan? What about the territorial integrity and sovereignty of India? Don't we count? Let me again tell you, I don't believe it's a racist kind of thing. I don't believe that because the Ukrainians are, on average, maybe a little, have a little less, if I may say so, exposure to the sunlight than we in India do, or ASEAN does, or the Taiwanese do. But we are astonished by this charge of the Light Brigade. And quite frankly, I'd like to say that the perception that all that the West cares about is the other side of the Atlantic. They don't really care about Asia or Latin America or Africa. That perception took very deep root subsequent to what we are seeing play out in Ukraine. And as a consequence, you're given an opening to the Sino Russian and the Sino Wahhabi alliance to be very active in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And I think what I'm happy about is the G20 meeting. You saw Biden and Modi march in lockstep. And you saw, Biden basically was extremely helpful, if I may say so, especially in dealing with some recalcitrant European members of the G7. I'm not going to name them, there are two of them. And, oh, well, Ukraine first and all that. Biden was very clear, no, we have to go along with India and we have to make sure this is a huge success. And he was very helpful with those two recalcitrant European members, one of whom, by the way, has a prime minister whose ancestry is from India. And the other was, frankly, the country that in the 1930s was basically prevented from was not prevented from launching a world war. I've given you the clues as to which these two countries are. But one, a country in Europe which launched the Second World War, and two, a country where I must say I'm delighted by that. We have somebody with Indian ancestry as the prime minister. But they were, no, Ukraine, 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 that kind of thing. So the fact of the matter is, Biden was very helpful in that. President Putin was very helpful. He made it very clear to Xi Jinping that, look, I don't want to see the Indians lose out by anything less than a unanimous Delhi declaration. And frankly, Xi is not the man he was. You remember when you had that Chingang, the foreign minister, when he disappeared, and everybody was saying, oh, this shows that Xi Jinping is becoming very strong, very powerful. He's just dismissed this guy, and now he's brought in Wang Yi. I was the only guy to point out, sorry guys, you're barking up the wrong tree. Qin Gang is a creation of Xi Jinping. He's Xi Jinping's robot, and Wang Yi is the Chinese Communist Party's, he's loyal to the CCP, not to Xi Jinping. And now you're seeing in the military, a lot of people whom Xi Jinping promoted have suddenly disappeared. You're seeing even the defense minister suddenly disappearing from sight. This is not because Xi Jinping is becoming stronger. I said from the start on television and in my writing that it shows that Xi Jinping is becoming weaker, and as a consequence, he could not say no to President Putin. So may I end this segment by pointing out Prime Minister Modi's excellent relationship with President Biden, excellent relationship with President Putin. That was the X factor behind the success of this G20 Delhi declaration. Yes, we can say that hundreds of people worked for it. Some worked very, very hard for it. I was also a small cog in this very large machine. I'm being the co-chair, the India co-chair of the T20, that is the Think 20 vertical of the G20. But the fact is, the summit, there are certain issues of such grave import that unless the summit is active, it doesn't work out. You can have hundreds of people being very sincere, hundreds of cogs working together. They'll all fail unless there's success at the summit level. And Prime Minister Modi's excellent relationship with President Biden on one hand and President Putin on the other played the keystone role in ensuring this Delhi Declaration was unanimously adopted. Unanimously adopted. And I think that is a real important change because it shows, I think the West is beginning to understand it is losing the rest with this Ukraine obsession. These days, I mean, I have a certain number of minutes in which I watch certain television channels. CNN, for example, my limit is about 6 or 7 minutes in a day. But I'm happy that previously, those 6 or 7 minutes, about 4 minutes would be Zelensky. Nowadays, I don't see Zelensky at all in those 3 or 4 or 6 minutes. Sometimes I want to go in for 20 minutes and I still don't see Zelensky. So that's a welcome change, very frankly, because let's be honest, this is not Cold War 1.0 with the USSR. That country is gone. Russia is not the USSR. Today, it's a different superpower challenging all of us as democracies. It's a different Cold War. And in that different Cold War, the theater is the Indo Pacific. And so far, I'm sorry to say, the United States is behaving as though they are stuck in the era of the first Cold War. I don't blame Joe Biden because throughout the time he was a senator, it was the first Cold War. And he's steeped in that. But I thought there are smarter people in the United States. But unfortunately, this Europeanist kind of thinking that we're all really Europeans fundamentally. And I find people who are, from different ethnicities going European, in American think tanks and American universities. They go European. And they're more European than the Europeans, frankly. Well, unfortunately, today It's the era where the Indo-Pacific is important. Eurasia is important. The South China Sea is important. The East China Sea is important. By the way, we should call the ASEAN Sea, not the South China Sea. I don't know why we are still calling it the South China Sea. But having said that, I wrote these two books, one after the other, basically to present a view of the world as it is. And that's why I titled this Illusion versus Reality. And I'm sorry to say, we all have a lot of illusions about the era we're living in, and that's very dangerous because if we get illusions translated into policy, it becomes like India in the 1950s, where we had a ton of opportunities, 1960s, 1970s, and we lost it because we believe the world should behave in our illusion of how it should behave. Unfortunately, the world behaves in the reality of how it will behave. And this book was written to reflect that reality.
Thank you, Professor Nalapat. You have very cogently articulated your worldview as well as the existing reality as we perceive it. A lot of us will agree with your viewpoint. However, there are always some nuances and some caveats. So, one of the caveats, going back to your response about US foreign policy or US perception about these things, uh, I may invoke a saying by Napoleon Bonaparte when he characterized Britain as the nation of shopkeepers. Unfortunately, in post-World War II scenario, United States, which became the reigning hegemon of the world, assumed the role of the world's nation of shopkeepers. That is one, and that's why you see that there is reluctance to transfer advanced weapons to India without extracting the pound of flesh. So that is one thing. Second issue, you said that the policies are not racist, but they have ignored Asia, they have ignored Africa, they have ignored Taiwan, they have ignored the occupied nationalities in Asian subcontinent, Northeast Asia, etc., etc. What more do we want? They have an alliance called Five Eye Alliance. And who are the members of Five Eye Alliance? That very cogently tells you that Five Eyes is an Anglo-Saxon alliance. And on the same platform, I asked Professor Salvatore Babones as to why United States did not consider offering India a place in the AUKUS alliance, and he was very explicit. Look, we are an Anglo-Saxon alliance. India does not belong there. So, all said and done, going European by American diplomats, there is an element of European superiority or Caucasian superiority. Any comments?
Look, Dr. Adityanjee, I pardon me, but the nation of shopkeepers now is the People's Republic of China. Your industry has been hollowed out. Your shelves are filled with Chinese items made in China. Your technology has been flowing to China for a long time. In the 1990s, Bill Clinton, for example, he opened the candy store to China and he locked it for India. He tried to prevent India from having its own nuclear deterrent. And we would have been helpless against the Chinese if we had not persevered in having that deterrent. Our space program, he went after our space program. I'm sorry, the British were a nation of shopkeepers, the Americans took over, now it's the Chinese. It's no longer you, let's be honest. You're a hollowed out industrial base, you have a hollowed out manufacturing base. Your technology base is surviving mainly because we have a lot of good talent coming in. Nobody outside China, I think people would like to work in an atmosphere in China. But the reality is that China is now become the shopkeepers of the world, the shop, the Walmart of the world. And it's no accident that Walmart has been sourcing so much of its stuff from China. So much of its stuff is being sourced from China. That's not an accident. You make more money, and that's all that counts. Now, we're talking about money. Hey, that's right. But then, from that point of view, why are you giving all that thing to Ukraine free of cost then? How much has the American taxpayer paid so far for Ukraine? I'd like to know. I mean, and when you look at that, and you look at the fact that you're making a huge ton of money from India and Taiwan, then the question comes, why is Ukraine so much more important? Now, you talked about the AUKUS alliance. Quite frankly, we have already got nuclear powered submarines. We have got a very good deal coming out of the United States on mini nuclear reactors. Both of us are going to collaborate on that. Both India and the United States are going to collaborate on that. We're not interested in the AUKUS. Frankly, bringing the European powers into the Indo Pacific is always a risky proposition. Now, we have this corridor, which is again a very, if I may say so, good idea. India, you go to the Middle East, go to Europe. And the Americans are now hand in hand with the Europeans marching through Africa. We don't want that. Let's be honest. What's happening to the French in Africa is what's going to happen to the British, possibly in Kenya tomorrow, or what's going to happen to other Europeans in Africa tomorrow if they make the geopolitical mistakes that they've been making. So let's be honest, we're not interested in, in that kind of a collaboration, but AUKUS, we have got our own little thing in the United States, we've got our whole thing going with Japan, we'll have our own little things going, you know. But as far as being Anglo-Saxon is concerned, Dr. Adityanjee, I was, we are having a conference called WALT, WaltCon 2023, and I gave the keynote address for some reason. They invited me. And we have a lot of friends who are coming from Europe and the United States, and they were surprised the amount of English signboards. I think we have more English-speaking people in India than we have in the United States of America. So I wrote a paper once in the New Criterion about a 21st century Anglosphere. The Churchillian Anglosphere was the blood of the body. As you said, DNA, ethnicity. DNA is the same, but ethnicity. My point is the blood of the mind. And in that, language, etc., values, a common thing about the rule of law, democracy, etc. And I said India will be a fulcrum of the 21st century, Anglosphere. And this was published about maybe several years ago in the New Criterion. It must be there somewhere. If you access some of my writings, you'll see that the 21st century Anglosphere. So I think the very definition of Anglo-Saxon is changing. And you can see that happen in an America where you have Barack Obama as the president, where you have Rishi Sunak as the prime minister, and where, so the very definition of Anglo-Saxon is now changing as the world is changing, number one. Number two, you have a large number of people from India in all these countries which are members of the Five Eyes. But I again like to say, yes, I think, I'm a little worried about New Zealand being part of the Five Eyes, for example. There are some people in New Zealand who are a little too romantic about China, shall we say. But I'm sure that the Americans, the Japanese are keeping a watch on all that. I'm sure within the UK, etc., there is an understanding of that. But India is already now linking up in intelligence with even with Taiwan, certainly with the United States, certainly with Japan, certainly with a lot of other countries. And from that point of view, we have, I mean, in a sense, we are not formally a Five Eyes kind of thing, nor do we need to be. But I think in our country, in Asia, in India, it's not just the formalities that count. It's the informal understanding and trust. And I think informal linkages, informal trust, informal coming together, especially intelligence sharing, is happening on a very vastly, rapidly accelerating scale. So I wouldn't be pessimistic if I were you, frankly. I wouldn't be pessimistic at all. As I said, Dr. Adityanjee, you and I mean, in my census, in the Indian census, I don't know English. I'm not recorded in the census as knowing English because I'm Malayalam speaking. I mean, I do speak a few words of English, but according to my census, I don't speak English. But there are more than 300 million people in this country who speak English, possibly the same as yours. So these definitions, I think we need to make changes in these definitions and to meet current realities. Because that's again what I say. I mean, I feel you're perfectly at home in the United States as an American, as you should be. And America, especially, is a quadri-continental country. It's Latin American, it's Asian, it's African, it's European. And so far as the word Caucasian is concerned, frankly, that's talking about the Caucasus, it's talking about Georgia, Stalin, and things like that. But the fact is that this is a function of sunlight. And anybody, I mean, you bring people in, and over generations, for example, you see in South Africa, you have individuals who have 100% Dutch blood, and their complexions are very different from what their ancestors were. It's a function of that. So I would only like to say that I don't believe in that kind of a division, and especially racial divisions. In my view, I think a lot of us are now going beyond that kind of division. And for example, I was talking to some of the friends who have come for this conference, Americans, and the majority of them would like Nikki Haley to be the next president. I'm not sure Nikki Haley is a Caucasian by the definition that was just expressed, by the CSA. No, she's not. She's from India, and she's from the Punjab, and she's a very proud daughter of the Punjab. She's unlike that chap, that governor who tried to run away from the fact that he was an Indian. Nikki Haley is quite open about the fact that she is Indian. She's proud of being an Indian. And she's, I mean, a lot of people who have no Indian ancestry like her very much. So I think we are living in a changing world, and the difficulty we are facing is actually in the 1930s, the Polish people, for example, the Polish government, they refused to allow an entente between France, Britain, and Russia. For years, they refused to allow that. Why? Because they felt Russia was the bigger enemy than Germany. And you know what happened in Poland after they were occupied by the Germans? They paid a heavy price for that because they lived in the past. So I think it's important, Dr. Adityanjee, that especially a forum like the CSA, which has really got some outstanding talent in it, if I may say so, we have to live in the present. And in the present, I think we have to jump beyond this kind of classification into different classifications based on reality.
So, moving into another direction, you have tried to articulate differences between Cold War 1.0 versus 2.0. Cold War 1.0 was solely directed towards one power, and that was USSR. Cold War II realities are slightly different. A section of US establishment still continues to view the successor state Russia in the prism of Cold War 1.0. So the perception is that the Cold War 2.0 adversaries are both China and Russia, and in certain minds, Russia is still the main adversary, and some think tanks in US are talking about dismantling the Russian Federation.
Hmm.
As you know, Cold War 1.0 led to the breakup of Soviet Union. In your perception, would successful conclusion of Cold War 2.0 lead to breakup of Russian Federation or breakup of Chinese Empire?
Look, frankly, it's no longer Russia, it's China that is the principal challenge. There's no question about it. and it was the USSR and its satellites is now the Chinese and their they call in the Chinese language Jimmy system, that is the system of tributary states. So from that point of view, it's very definitely China. Very frankly, that is the thing. So far as Russia is concerned, I was fascinated by the views of two individuals. One is a guy called Donald Trump, whom I think we have all heard of. The other is a chap called Vivek Ramaswamy. And I heard Vivek Ramaswamy, one of his speeches, and that's the greatness of the internet. We've got so many of these channels. Say that one of the first things we're going to do is going to go make a trip to Moscow to de-link Russia from China. And that is a very interesting hypothesis, quite frankly, because if you remember Nixon, it was not Kissinger. Kissinger was opposed to that reach out to China. He, of course, claimed to be the founder of that when it succeeded. It was actually Nixon who did that. But the fact is that it was a brilliant move on the part of the United States to dealing to ensure that China and the United States worked in concert against the USSR. What is being proposed by politicians in the United States now, not politicians who believe that they are, like the Clintons or the Lindsey Grahams, that they're basically Europeans who have somehow some on the other side of the Atlantic and they're called Americans, but they are fundamentally Europeans, not such politicians, but real Americans, true blue Americans. Well, in my personal view, they understand the importance of separating Russia from China. And may I point out that the Russians remember the history of Cold War 1.0 very, very well. The Chinese stabbed them in the back, in the front, in the side, everywhere. And the Americans were very smart at that point in time. Smart in a way that, frankly, they're being very unsmart today. Because I think Vivek Ramaswamy and Donald Trump have it right. Donald Trump had it right in trying to de-link North Korea, for example, from China. And today you're seeing Vladimir Putin, in effect, de-link North Korea from China. Because after G20, Vladimir Putin now once again, I think, has understood that the United States is no longer as fixated on Cold War 1.0 as it used to be. Otherwise, India would never have got this Delhi Declaration through. In that sense, so he's also decided to be more Russian and less of a satellite to China. So he's now got Kim Jong Un, and on his side. And quite frankly, as everybody, all these think tanks are saying Russia is the enemy, that kind of thing. China is not the enemy. Well, Putin is saying yes. If you remember Rupert Murdoch, there was a chap called Harold Evans, I think, who was the editor of the Times, and Rupert Murdoch told him, "You treat me as an outsider, I'll behave as an outsider." So the Russians are now saying, you treat us as outsiders, as enemies, we behave as enemies. And they are going to do some very dangerous things, in my view, with North Korea. My worry, frankly, is they're going to arm North Korea with some pretty deadly weapons, which the North Koreans would then use, and God knows where they will use it. And then the concept of the proxy nuclear state, which a concept that was introduced, I believe, by me many years ago, will come into play. That you have the arming of a country as a proxy nuclear power, that country launches an attack. And what are you going to attack? Are you going to attack the proxy country or the main country? Well, look, I want to tell you one thing very, very clearly. It made sense to dealing to make sure China was on your side in Cold War 1.0. It makes sense to de-link Russia from China and put Russia on your side against China because fundamentally the Russian and Chinese interests are not aligned. They're not aligned in Central Asia. They're not aligned anywhere, quite frankly. And India is one country that can be a bridge, if I may say so, to that kind of an alignment. And we played a very important bridge building role, incidentally, in this G20 meeting. An image that I immediately talked about on television, which is Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and Joe Biden, having a warm handshake with Prime Minister Modi, with his hands on both of their hands. It's a very important step because the reality is Mohammed bin Salman has tried to move the Al Saud family from Wahhabism. As a consequence, there was an effort to remove him, regime change. In Saudi Arabia, regime change is a capital offense. Of course, it's unpardonable the manner in which that particular capital offense, the capital punishment was carried out. You live in a country, I live in a country where criminals are sentenced to death and they hang or they die or they're in whatever in the electric chair or injection or whatever. But what was done, the particular way of execution of that particular individual who tried for regime change was horrible. But regime change is a capital offense in Saudi Arabia. I have never once attacked Mohammed bin Salman because the big issue to me is that he is the first Al Saud to go against Wahhabism. He is somebody to be supported. And India has always had the warmest of relationships with him. Prime Minister Modi, look at Prime Minister Modi, the warmest of relationship with Israel, the warmest of relationship with Saudi Arabia, the warmest of relationship with President Putin, the warmest of relationship with Joe Biden. So if you ask me, I think it's a huge plus for all of us that we have Prime Minister Modi with this kind of good relationship, which frankly, many people in the United States, many people even in Russia were not very happy with. But the reality is that approach is what ensured a Delhi declaration. Despite massive efforts by Xi Jinping and some of his other parties to sabotage the G20 summit and make it a failure. On the other hand, it was a tremendous success, frankly, a huge success. And it was because of summit level democracy at the highest level, summit level dialogue at the highest level, summit level diplomacy at the highest level between Prime Minister Modi and President Biden, Prime Minister Modi and President Putin that secured this particular agreement. So I don't really like to say, Dr. Adityanjee, we are in a changing world. As far as China is concerned, I would like to say that certainly Tibet, Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, Manchuria, these were really never parts of China. Now, one thing is clear: only one side will win in this Cold War 2.0. One side won in Cold War 1.0, the other side disintegrated. Which side will win till today, I'm not able to predict, frankly. It could be our side, it could be Xi Jinping's side. I'm not going to say it's going to be our side. As of now, I can't, as somebody who's an analyst, say that. But whichever side wins, the other side is going to pay a very heavy price for it, including in terms of possible breakup of the territories that they now control. And may I just end this particular segment by pointing out it was Manmohan Singh actually who pointed out a very interesting facet regarding the Chinese leadership and the Indian leadership. Manmohan Singh was not really a congressman. He's not really a congressman. He said, look, when we became free, at that point in time, Myanmar, we claimed to be the inheritors of the British Empire. That's why we got the name India. Otherwise, it should have been Bharat. And I personally feel the very strong case for Bharat because that goes back thousands of years. India doesn't go back that deep in time. But Myanmar was gone. Pakistan was gone. What is now Bangladesh was gone. I mean, Nepal, all these places were gone. That was basically essentially controlled from Delhi. Even the Middle East had a huge influence. Delhi had a huge influence in the Middle East. The rupee was legal tender in the Middle East. The rupee was legal tender in Southeast Asia. All that went. But in the case of China, Mao Zedong expanded to Tibet, to Xinjiang, to Manchuria, to Inner Mongolia. He expanded everywhere, all over the place. So that's the difference in thinking. You know, India, if you're talking about India as a successor of British India covered a lot more territory than the Republic of India does. Whereas Imperial China covered a lot less territory that the People's Republic of China has. So, I'd only like to say, I hope our side prevails in Cold War 2.0. I hope it remains a Cold War 2.0 like Cold War 1.0 was. I hope one side, that is the other side, is defeated. And I'd like to see that we don't go in for a third world war, because that would be quite a horrible catastrophe. We could finally win, but it will be a terrible cost. I'd like to win Cold War 2.0 without a war. And that's why, Dr. Adityanjee, I brought this book, because I believe the alliances that I've sketched out in these two books and the reasons for it, which I sketched out in this book, are very important as a deterrent to war. And I think what we're seeing in China today, the economy and various other things, we are seeing a non kinetic effect of, uh, of certain activities. And one of them is decoupling, you know, and that is very, very helpful, because it is so incredible that, you now, I mean, the United States is contributing about 600, $700 billion to the Chinese trade surplus. India is contributing $100 billion, and they're doing even ever more unfriendly things against both of us. You remember, for about 3 or 4 years ago, I started talking on television also, and privately. 4 years television over about 3 years since COVID. The Chinese have been active in Indian and American social media. Why? In widening the fault lines in our democracies, in 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 strengthening the fringe and shrinking the moderate middle, and that they want to weaken our societies, hollow it out from within, hollow out manufacturing, hollow out societal cohesion. And you can see, the kind of dialogues that are taking place in social media are very divisive dialogues, are very fringe dialogues. And fringe dialogues are overpowering moderate dialogues. And that's a scary thing. And believe me, it's not happening accidentally. It's happening because the Chinese concept of war, historically, has been a very broad concept. Agriculture, industry, health, mental health, everything. This is all part of war. It's not just kinetic as it is in the West. So, having said that, I'd like to say that, quite frankly, Dr. Adityanjee, Russia, I would say three cheers to Donald Trump and Vivek Ramaswamy. They got it right. Unfortunately, Joe Biden, Tony Blinken, and Jake Sullivan got it wrong, and they jumped ahead on the European bus. Actually, it was Boris Johnson who basically put the whole thing on steroids, thinking that if there's a war in Europe and in which Britain is active, he will not be kicked out as the prime minister. It didn't work out. He was kicked out. Biden, because of the Ukraine war, I think possibly that's not going to help him in his election. I can tell you, come the election in November of next year. But the fact of the matter is very, very simple. The fact is that Russia and China, we should play the same game as was played by the United States in the first Cold War, and delink one of these countries from each other, so the other country is left to fend on its own.
Professor Nalapat, we are coming to the end of the interview as we are running out of time. So, my final comment is actually quoting your own words. In the epilogue of your book, you state, in 20th century terms, we are now in 1937. The only way that a return of 1939 to 45 can be avoided is for the major democracies, especially the two great powers, among them India and United States, to acknowledge that and shape the future policies. And I think that's a very sage advice to the geopolitical establishment in both countries to identify where the chips are going to fall and what are the dangers of not cooperating with each other to prevent a bad outcome like what happened from 1939 to 1945. Any further comments on this?
I'd
before we
only like to
close?
say that I'm delighted to be here on your platform, Dr. Adityanjee. You have done human service, frankly, and we're all part of what I call, what in my definition of the 21st century, Anglosphere, the new Anglosphere, and that is the blood of the mind. And if I may say so, it's very possible to speak good English and be a patriotic Indian. I mean, I speak, Hindi very proudly. Of course, Malayalam and English. But the only point is, I got a Mumbai accent, and so sometimes when I speak Malayalam, Malayalis may not recognize it Malayalam, or if I speak Hindi, Hindi people may not recognize it Hindi because the Mumbai accent. I'm proud of my Mumbai accent. I love Mumbai. But having said that, I'd like to say they're all in the same boat, and we are confronting an expansionist power with an expansionist mindset. And Xi Jinping may go tomorrow. I think even if he becomes weak, but don't forget the only difference between Xi Jinping and, let's say, between Wang Yi and Qin Gang was very open, like Xi Jinping, about his expansionary aims. Wang Yi is very much more silent about expansionary aims. But don't forget, Deng Xiaoping had the same view as Mao Zedong. He also wanted China to expand. He also wanted the destruction of the United States. He wore a Texas hat, he wore boots, and he milked the United States. Jiang Zemin milked the United States very much. Hu Jintao milked the United States. Xi Jinping is milking the United States. 600, $700 billion dollars is now the trade thing with Xi Jinping. Everybody is milking the United States. There's no question about that. But the fact is, the fundamental objective of the Chinese Communist Party from the time it was founded, I think in 1921, is that China will be the number one power in the world under the Communist Party, and any other challenging power will be demolished before it can even stand up. And any power that is standing up should be made to fall down. So it is an existential conflict. The world recognized that Cold War 1.0 was existential. Today, a lot of the great think tankers, and may I say one thing, I have great respect for American education, but I would like to point out that whether it is the Vietnam War, whether it is some of the wars that we have seen, the Ukraine war, whether it is in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, I mean, all these wars were basically masterminded by the Ivy League people. You had Lyndon Johnson from Texas State Teachers College, and you had all these Ivy League chaps, and they told him, Lyndon, we got to fight. We got to fight in Vietnam, and we got to make sure this Ho Chi Minh, who's a basically a Chinese stooge, that he doesn't come there. Well, the fact is, Ho Chi Minh, in fact, because of the way the French attacked him and the Americans joined the French, his credentials as a patriotic Vietnamese was got multiplied manyfold, right from the time of Truman, from the from the passing away of Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt. From Truman's time, the Europeanist impulse took over U.S. foreign policy. So Roosevelt understood the new world. Truman went back to the old world, Dulles and people like that. And you look today, for example, the top positions in the United States. Let's talk about Blinken. Let's talk about Sullivan. Let's talk about Biden. I mean, Biden is different because you're a vice president and all that. But talk about others. You talk about American officials. 90 to 95% of their foreign travel is across the Atlantic. I'm not talking of Canada or Mexico or something like that, or Barbados, or some kind of a holiday. I'm talking of long distance foreign travel is across the Atlantic. 90 to 95%. Is the other side of the Atlantic 90 to 95% of geopolitics? Is it even 30% of geopolitics? It's not. But if you look at their travel schedules and you analyze them, you'll see the kind of skewed thinking they have. And you'll understand why they've got it so horribly wrong over and over and over and over again. So pardon me for saying so, but in my personal view, the Ivy League is lovely. If you got a ton of money, send your your children there. Let them have a lovely time. Let them have some good networking. But if you're talking of substantive policy, you need people who are close to the ground, not in la la land in the sky, in a very expensive la la land in the sky. And look at experience and look at the experience of success and failure. And if I may say so, look at Ukraine. Has it got back any of that land? No. What's happened to the country? You're seeing what's happened to the country. What happened to it? What's happening to it? And of course, I mean, look at Afghanistan. You handed it back to the Taliban. You handed it back to the very people that you spent $1 trillion trying to fight. How trying to fight? By linking up with the same people who are backers of the Taliban. At that point in time, some of us had said Pakistan will regret it. Now I have been saying China will regret it. Believe me, the Uyghurs are going to be active in Xinjiang in the way that that you got the Pashtuns active in Pakistan. The Chinese are going to understand that they have also made a mistake. But I'm only saying all this great talent and this great thinking and these great think tanks to which, if I may say so, I'm quite astonished. Indian billionaires love giving tens of millions of dollars to American and European universities. They don't give it to our universities, they give it to European and American universities. All that amount of money, all that amount of talent has got you into one mess after the other. Please, please understand one thing. Don't go by illusion, go by reality. And this book I intend as a reality check.
Thank you, Professor Nalapat. It was pleasure to have you on CSA platform. This was an important conversation on Cold War 2.0. My hope is that all the students of geopolitics and international relations will read Professor Nalapat's book, which reflects deep scholarship, thinking, and analysis. And I, for one, actually am in perfect agreement with your premise as well as your conclusions. So, thanks a lot once again, and hopefully, we shall have you on our platform in future as well. Thank
Thank
you
you.
very much indeed.
God
And
bless
this
you.
was the
Namaskar.
seventh episode of Strategically Speaking with Dr. Adityanjee, a new feature of Council for Strategic Affairs, where we invite distinguished guests who speak only on one single topic for an hour or so. And our guest today was Professor Madhav Das Nalapat, talking about his latest book, Cold War 2.0, Illusions versus Reality. Thank you very much indeed.